Welcome to Echoes of Ransomware, Uncovering a Cyber Blast Radius. I'm Dr. Christian Dameff. I'm a practicing emergency medicine physician and clinical informatician. I also serve as the medical director of cybersecurity for UC San Diego Health in California.
My name is Jeff Tully. I am a specialist in pediatrics as well as anesthesiology, and I also work at the University of California, San Diego.
We have many responsibilities at work, just like you out there, but our most important responsibility is taking care of patients. We both practice a specialty of medicine that sometimes can be mundane. We take care of patients with colds, mild viruses, earaches, but we also are trained to take care of patients sometimes when they're very, very sick. And in emergency medicine and in anesthesia, our practice does not have regular hours. We are always open. The emergency department will be open 24/7, 365 days a year, and we're trained to take care of illnesses such as trauma, stroke, heart attacks, severe infections. And that's our primary responsibility at our hospitals.
I like to say in anesthesia that to put a patient to sleep for surgery, I perform a DDoS attack on their brain, and then after a surgeon has poked them with a hot knife, when we wake them up, I give them painkillers to perform a man-in-the-middle attack on their nervous system and keep them comfortable. That's just a little bit of a hacker joke there. I would also like to mention that you may be familiar with code blue in the medical sense as being a very serious emergency in the hospital. A patient who has stopped breathing or a heart attack. And Christian and myself have to deal with many of those situations, and they are not fun. So I would like to thank you in advance for having this be the most pleasant code blue we will ever have in our entire careers. You might be wondering at this point, though, why are two doctors up here at a security conference talking to us?
And that's because long before we were doctors, we grew up as hackers. And so it's something that we were very just lucky to do growing up, never knowing that it could be a career or that there would be conferences of people here talking about cybersecurity. Because when we grew up in the space, it wasn't called cybersecurity, it was just called hacking.
I'd like to share a picture with you that is very important to Christian and myself. This is a painting that we were shown in our first couple of days of medical school. And appropriately, it is titled The Doctor. We see at the center of the frame a sick patient, and the doctor is close at the bedside. He's concerned. He's attentive. He cares about her. This is the essence of the doctor-patient relationship that we try to have with our patients. But of course, the bedside of today looks very different. We rely on very complex medical technologies to care for the sickest of patients. We still have the patient in the center, but you see that this patient is surrounded on the left, for example, with infusion pumps, which can deliver life-saving medications to this patient. Those pumps have Wi-Fi access so that they can receive updates that can change the types of drugs and the amounts they're programmed to deliver. This patient needs a ventilator to help them breathe. And modern ventilators are very, very precise at the amount of air that they can deliver with each breath. And they do that with complex software. And as Miko-san showed us yesterday, these are some of the smartest devices possible, which implies that they're also vulnerable.
Many of you out there are aware of this problem. We have for almost 20 years now had reports of vulnerable medical devices. Here are just 3 examples. Let's take a minute to just talk about each one so you can understand the gravity of what we're talking about when a medical device has a vulnerability. The first category of devices widely reported to have vulnerabilities were pacemakers. So this is a pretty landmark paper in 2008 that some security researchers, some cardiologists, they got together and they looked at pacemakers. These are devices about the size of a small deck of cards. It's implanted into the chest of a patient and it connects to their heart via some wires. And this pacemaker's job is to monitor the heart, to tell it when to beat if necessary. And some of these devices have a capability that if your heart should go into a deadly rhythm, it can even shock you to basically save your life. This work showed, after reverse engineering, there was a critical issue and it could be reprogrammed at a distance wirelessly, and that the settings could be altered. You could cause a patient's heart rate to be 200 if you wanted at all times. And they even demonstrated that you could shock a patient when they didn't need it. And if that patient receives that shock when they don't need it, it could potentially kill them. And that was just the start. We had similar reports from security researchers at some of the biggest conferences in the world talking about insulin pumps. We all know these are amazing devices that diabetics can use to administer insulin to them and change their life. Well, many models run Bluetooth. And as many of you in this room know, the security of Bluetooth can wildly vary. And in this case, several researchers demonstrated how they could change dosing limits and the administration of insulin potentially into patients. And then over and over again, we keep having examples of vulnerable medical technology.
We've made progress with medical devices. There is still work to be done, but we'd like to talk to you today about ransomware. Because unfortunately, the criminal organizations that Miko-san talked about yesterday are not kind enough to leave hospitals alone. We have seen an increasing number of ransomware attacks which disrupt the ability of hospitals to provide care to patients. You may recall the WannaCry attack in 2017, which impacted over 100 countries around the world, but particularly hit the United Kingdom and resulted in disruptions at over 80 of the National Health Service hospitals. Appointments for cancer patients were delayed, surgeries were canceled, ambulances were diverted. We have seen attack after attack, especially in recent years in the United States as well, where we have very large healthcare networks made up of many hospitals over many states, which again highlights some of the issues discussed yesterday with respect to geography and how that doesn't matter in situations like this.
This world where we discuss the vulnerability of medical devices, we hear more and more about that, where we hear news reports of hospitals being ransomed, has really caused two factions to develop in this space. A lot of what we're going to talk about today, we want to personalize for you. And I want you to think about which camp or group of people you agree with most. One group says the sky is falling, that patients are going to die or have died by this, that this is a really big catastrophe. That's one group. There's another group of people who think that this threat is overblown, that we're frightening people, that we've been taking care of patients for thousands of years without technology like this. What really does it matter if you get ransomed? Why can't you still take care of somebody? What is the ground truth? What is the reality of the world? Is it that patients are harmed? Or is this all fear, uncertainty, and doubt? We're going to try to convince you of one way today.
It's very natural when we are looking for truth to seek out people in positions of authority. This is a predecessor of ours who, if you were sick in the Middle Ages in Europe, you might have gone to a doctor who looked like this. And you might have told him what your ailment was, and he might have prescribed you some cutting-edge therapies. He may have put leeches on your body to drain out bad liquids. Or if that didn't work, we might use mercury, because we all know that mercury helps to remove toxins. And who doesn't feel better after you let out a couple liters of blood every now and again, right? We look at these treatments as preposterous now, but at the time, that was the best available option for many people, and it was supported by apprentices and masters and experts who have trained and passed down this type of knowledge for many, many years. And it's not like medicine hasn't been controversial relatively recently. Something as simple as washing your hands around 200 years ago, very, very doubtful that that was actually going to make a big difference. And the doctor who first recommended that, he lost his job because his colleagues got very angry that he implied that they were dirty. And so now, this is one of the most basic steps we use to keep ourselves and our patients safe. But at the time, very controversial.
So how did we get to where we are today? How did we go from leeches and mercury and bloodletting to amazing life-saving technologies and sometimes even cures for diseases? Well, many of you know this. Medicine underwent something called the evidence-based medicine revolution. We employed the scientific method to try to find out what the truth of the world was. We know the process. Everyone is taught this now. You develop a hypothesis. Treatment A is better than treatment B. You go about trying to find patients with a particular disease, and then you give them drug A or drug B. You measure the effects on the disease, and then you objectively, honestly analyze the results to come to a conclusion. This is the scientific method. We are all familiar with this. But not all evidence is equal. And this is a common way to describe the hierarchy or growing assurance or level of evidence. This is called the evidence pyramid. And it's important to know that on the bottom in green and orange are the lowest levels of evidence. These are things that may be very weak evidence in support of something. But as you go higher up the pyramid, you pool more and more data together. You're more rigorous in your scientific process. And at the end, when you're on the top, you can be pretty sure that you know which treatment or action is the best. We're going to pose to you a pretty controversial statement.
Are we here in cybersecurity? Are we in the days of leeches and bloodletting? Do we have the evidence that we need to make decisions about what works and what doesn't? And this is not a problem that is unique to healthcare or healthcare cybersecurity. We all have to make decisions on how to allocate limited resources. And so where do we get the information to make those decisions? In many cases, we rely on sources, things like technical frameworks, regulators, a vendor that says that this control is better than that, or this product is more efficient than that. We may follow cybersecurity experts on Twitter and get our advice that way, or people standing in front of you at conferences like this. But this is at the very bottom of that pyramid we discussed. Expert opinion. It can only take us so far, and we need to figure out a way to start climbing this pyramid to better evidence.
Two questions. How do you know what the right action is if you don't measure its effect? How do you know which control you should employ at your organization when you have limited budgets? Should you do multi-factor authentication? Should you do some new endpoint solution? We only have a limited budget. Which one are we going to pick? How do you make your decision? Do you rely on expert opinion, or do you have data to drive? And as Jeff mentioned, cybersecurity is a team sport. You don't make these decisions by yourself. You consult with other people on your team. And you have to be able to convince other people, other stakeholders that are responsible for budgets and decisions to make one decision or the other. How can you convince them of the right action if you can't show them what you've done in the past, the attacks you've prevented, or the effectiveness of your security program? This is the security Tetris problem that Miko talked about yesterday, wherein if you're successful in your job, there are no measured attacks. You defend them. There are no breaches. And as a consequence, your ability to convince other people to do some action reduces because, look, you're doing a great job.
So let's start and say, what evidence do we have to begin with? We know that threats are increasing. Ransomware is becoming more prevalent in every sector, not just in healthcare, but we do have a colleague of ours who published a paper last year that demonstrated over a 5-year period the number of attacks have gone significantly up. On the y-axis is the number of attacks, on the x-axis are the years, and you can see in 2020 and 2021, attacks increased significantly. Unfortunately, we were also dealing with a global pandemic at that time, so that's not ideal. But associated with each one of these attacks is also the release of very valuable and sensitive patient information.
So if we have good evidence to show us that attacks are increasing and that breaches are still very significant, it still doesn't prove to us that patients are being harmed. The question is, how dependent are doctors and nurses and other healthcare providers on the technology that they use every day? This is an interesting study. It's performed in 2013, so I guarantee you the results are probably even more striking if we replicated this experiment today. But they had researchers follow around doctors and calculate how much time they spent doing various tasks. Many of you out there are probably shocked to find out that physicians in this study only spent 28% of their day talking to patients, examining patients, doing procedures. Almost half the time was spent in front of a computer. Now, in this case, they called it data entry. But as a practicing doctor, I can tell you what they really were doing was working with a system called the electronic health record. Jeff and I describe this as the operating system of healthcare. Why? Because it is so important and fundamental to healthcare delivery. In this program, I am able to see prior patient results, their prior notes from other visits. I'm able to see critical laboratory tests or results of imaging like X-rays. I use this program to order things, to put in medications that I want given to this patient, or even to send them home. This monolithic software powers healthcare. In this study, they also discovered that doctors spent did over 4,000 mouse clicks. It just goes to speak how really, truly dependent they are on this technology. But this still doesn't prove that someone could be hurt. Yeah, they might be really dependent on it. But that doesn't mean someone's going to die. So what happens when ransomware hits a hospital? They'll go into a state of downtime. And downtimes can occur for many reasons other than ransomware. An earthquake, an internet outage, the server room could flood. Hospitals do, most of them, prepare for these types of downtimes by preparing paper workflows and policies and procedures on what they're going to do if this happens. This was another very interesting study in 2018. And they looked at reports of bad patient outcomes. So these are nurses, doctors, other people telling hospitals something bad happened to a patient. And they looked at those reports that occurred during downtimes. What did they find? They found that in almost a near majority of the reports, about 46% of the time, downtime procedures were not followed or did not exist. And that on only a quarter of the time did the staff actually execute downtime procedures like they had planned. More so concerning was the fact that the reports of what had happened involved concerning issues like timely administration of medications or the viewing of critical laboratory tests. Yet, are we still there, Jeff? Have we proved it?
So we've seen that there are disruptions to processes and workflows, and that may be very inconvenient, but you might find yourself with a very fair question, which is, that doesn't necessarily mean that people have been hurt. Do you have any evidence of that? Or in its bleakest sense, do you have any evidence of someone who's died from a ransomware attack? And unfortunately, we have stories to suggest that that may be the case. It is not great data, but it is data. In 2020, a patient in Germany had a very unfortunate medical emergency that needed emergency surgery. The ambulance brought her to the closest hospital. That hospital was under a ransomware attack and could not help her. So she was then taken to a more distant hospital and unfortunately passed away en route. Another tragic story followed a year later in Alabama when a mother came to deliver a baby. The hospital was also experiencing a ransomware attack, did not disclose that information to the mother at the time. The mother had a fetal heart monitor. The monitor was checking on the health of the baby before it was born. There was a problem. That problem was not communicated to the doctor that was overseeing the baby. The baby had an emergency after it was born, and very sadly, it passed away shortly thereafter. Beyond just individual patients, we know that sometimes there can be impacts to entire communities. A hospital shut down in Illinois a couple of months ago, in part due to financial difficulties it had experienced following a ransomware attack. And a hospital shutting down in a community means that all of the future patients it could have helped now need to go other places for care. Very impactful.
So we know that attacks are increasing. We know that doctors and nurses rely on technology to do their job. We know that plans that are made when that technology is not there are not followed very often and cause issues. And we know from stories that patients are likely being harmed. But why do we only have 1 or 2 cases to talk to you about today? Why? Why are there not more? And the issue, I think, falls into 3 broad categories. Jeff and I think that reputational harms or concerns from the hospitals drive a lot of their decisions. What do I mean by that? Hospitals do not want to be seen as unsafe places to get care. They don't want patients to be afraid to go to a hospital because they're going to get ransomed or they're going to leak their data. So instead, hospitals choose not to talk about what happens, choose not to share the effects and the bad outcomes that happened at their organization as a result. They also are afraid of legal liability. If they talk about this publicly and there's a bad patient outcome and they are sued, they can suffer severe financial consequences. And the last reason we feel like this is a difficult thing for hospitals to report is that how do we find out when patients are harmed? How do we measure their effects? How do we know how long it took a patient to get from surgery to getting their appendix out? Well, we measure that in the electronic health record. The systems we use to measure patient care are what goes out during a ransomware attack. So a lot of hospitals don't know what happened to their patients, don't know about the bad outcomes or the opportunities where they could have done better if they had had those systems. This presents a unique challenge as researchers because what we'd like to do is go to a hospital that's been hit with ransomware and ask them for all the bad stuff that happened so we could report it to you and understand, again, at the beginning of this talk, what is the reality of the world? Are patients getting harmed or not? But because of this, many won't talk to us. So we went about thinking about how do we solve this problem, or how do we get at that core? And we decided to measure what happens around hospitals that are hit with ransomware. The ripple effects, if you will, the blast radius of a cyber attack. Measuring what happens at hospitals next to hospitals infected with ransomware. And it's exactly what happened in 2021. Conti attacked 5 hospitals in San Diego. We just so happened to practice medicine in San Diego at a hospital system that was not ransomed. And what did we see? We saw a whole bunch of spillover effects into our hospital because they were impacted. We published our work in this journal. We have a link to the QR code if you want to read this paper at the end of our talk. And we went about this in a scientific way. We measured 4 weeks before the ransomware attack, 4 weeks during the attack, and 4 weeks after. And we looked in the emergency department because we found that that was the place we were most concerned about. Sometimes minutes matter. Patients come in with life-threatening, time-sensitive medical conditions. And so we wanted to understand what happened from the time they came by ambulance or walked into our waiting room to when they were admitted to the hospital or discharged. We found some interesting things.
And this is some of the first data that's been published on the direct patient effects of a cybersecurity incident like this. Patients flooded into our emergency department. We had an almost 20% increase in the number of patients that we were caring for, which is a lot. Patients who were there in the emergency room waited longer to receive care. The number of patients who waited and then left before they had been seen by a doctor also increased. Patients who were sick enough to need to be admitted to the hospital waited longer in this situation than they would have otherwise. And we got an increased number of very sick patients, patients with conditions like stroke, where there is a blockage of blood to the brain, and you need to relieve that blockage as quickly as possible to reduce the chance of disability or death. The number of stroke patients we received almost doubled. And that was in part because these 3 out of the 5 hospitals that were infected normally took care of stroke patients. So we got all of that spillover effect. We saw a regional impact on ambulance use. When an ambulance has a patient and they're going to the hospital and the hospital says we cannot accept that patient, the hospital's on what's called diversion. And we saw the diversion hours in San Diego skyrocket at the beginning of this ransomware attack because the hospital could not accept patients. That means that patients who need care need to go further to get it and wait longer to receive it.
We were quite shocked when we found these things out. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is data from 2 hospitals next to a hospital system that was ransomed. This is just one department and just looking at ambulances. Can you imagine all the other effects that happened throughout San Diego because of this? The takeaway we'd like to impress upon you today is really twofold. One is that I hope we challenged you a little bit to think about what evidence you use to make your decisions and whether or not you can go about designing ways to collect data, to critically analyze it, to employ the scientific method, and ultimately make better decisions about cybersecurity. We also, through this work, hope that you realize how interconnected healthcare and many other industries are. In this case, we described how we were impacted because another hospital was hit. we're in the same boat. We're all connected. We're only as strong as our weakest link. And we got to do something about it.
Our work as physicians and security researchers recently culminated in the creation of a Center for Healthcare Cybersecurity at UC San Diego. So we hope to continue to produce the high-quality evidence that can help us all make better decisions about cybersecurity. Our goal is to prevent as many ransomware attacks as we can. We know that it will be impossible to prevent all of them. These issues will continue to happen. But we'd like to also develop ways to identify attacks as quickly as they occur without the hospitals themselves needing to notify us. And lastly, if we can help to train physicians, nurses, and other people in the hospital to better operate during a ransomware attack, we may be able to lower some of these patient safety impacts and hopefully save lives. So if you are interested in learning more, please visit our website, and we are always happy to discuss our work and potential collaborations. Again, this is the QR code for the paper. These are our email addresses. Please feel free to reach out with questions. I think we may have time for one or two here, but we would just like to, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Christian and Jeff. Now we would like to take questions from the floor. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
Please raise your hand. はい、では一番後ろの方お願い。
In the back, we're going to bring you a microphone.
For your wonderful talk, and I just wondering, you in this paper you do the statistic before ransomware attack and after ransomware attack, so no need for IRB in this research.
IRB approval, institutional review board approval.
Yeah.
We did have IRB approval. This research was approved by the University of California, San Diego, to make sure it was done in an ethical way.
Okay, so I just wondering, you have the approval before the ransomware attack or just after the ransomware attack?
Great question. No, this is all after.
Okay.
So we went back and looked at the data retrospectively. We've joked that on the pyramid of evidence we talked about earlier, one of the highest levels of evidence that you can have is something called a randomized controlled trial. That's when you do it ahead of time and you study its effects. You don't look backwards in time. You make your design and then you look forward. Unfortunately, no university in the world will allow us to be ransomware hospitals and see what happens. We'll get in trouble.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you. I think we can take one more question.
Afterwards as well, if people have additional questions.
真ん中のそちらの方ですかね。あ、はい。赤いカーディガンの方お願いいたします。
Yes, in the red sweatshirt.
Presentation. So I just wonder one thing. After you publish your research, do you observe any change of attitude with people around you? Like before they are not really, how to say this? They don't want you to study their hospitals, but after you publish your research, do you have observe any change of attitude?
Thank you very much for that question. The wonderful thing about evidence is that it makes it very hard for people to argue against that once you have that evidence. So before, it was very easy to say ransomware attacks don't really matter. Sometimes this is the hospitals who are under attack that are saying this, but now we have some evidence, not as much as we would like, but some evidence. We have been very fortunate to be able to have conversations and relationships with people in various areas of the government that have taken this into account and have used it to start to work on certain policy changes in the United States. We've received a very good response from many of our colleagues in hospitals. So this type of work does matter because it can start to change some of these attitudes. Thank you very much.